Good evening and welcome to Access Iowa City, a program about the independent living and disability rights movement in southeastern Iowa. Access Iowa City is brought to you by generous contribution from the Noon Pilots Club of Johnson County in collaborations with the Extended Dream Foundation, Access to Independence, and the Center for Disabilities and Development, as well as all the hardworking folks here at Public Access Television Channel 18. I'm Terry Cunningham, President of the Board of Directors of Access to Independence, Vice Chair of the Johnson County Mental Health Disability Services Planning Council, and an individual who's lived with a significant disability for over 41 years. Tonight we're glad to have Geoffrey Lauer, Chairperson of the Iowa Olmstead Consumer Task Force, with us, as well as our friend Keith Ruff. We're going to talk about some of the history of the Olmstead Consumer Task Force in Iowa, which came about as the result of the Olmstead Supreme Court decision in 1999.
Yes. Just for the benefit of the public out there, could you briefly describe what caused the Olmstead Act?
Sure, I'll do my best. So today is, coincidentally, Keith, and you know this, the 22nd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act that has great roots here in Iowa.
Yes.
Our Senator Tom Harkin was a significant author and guiding force behind that. The ADA resulted in really a tremendous increase of awareness on and support for Americans with disabilities. The ADA hasn't done as much as we hoped it would do. Terry and I were talking before the show about how there are some a lot of significant areas to continue to move forward for. But one of the things that added a lot of oomph to the ADA was in 1999, which was about a decade in to the ADA. In 1999, there was a United States Supreme Court ruling in Georgia, and it's referred to as the Olmstead decision. And Olmstead is the last name of at the time, I believe it was the Georgia Health and Human Services Director. And this was a lawsuit in which two women who had wanted and desired to have community-based services and supports that were appropriate for their own supports, two women with disabilities who had been denied that in the state of Georgia and subsequently required to live in an institutional level of care, an institutional care setting. They took this complaint to the Georgia Supreme Court. It was referred then to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal to refuse persons with disabilities the services and supports that they needed if they were clearly, based on the recommendations of the professionals that supported them and their own personal desire, if they were desirous of living in the community. So it really opened up, it was a watershed for all the states in the country to kind of wake up and take a look at where are our dollars going? Are we funding community-based services and supports for people with disabilities, mental health disabilities, developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities from brain injury? Are we providing the supports to people that are in line with the law of the land? And if we're not, what can we do to do that so we can avoid having litigation in our state and probably losing? And that's actually where I have to pass the torch back to one of the two of you, because you were around, and I'm standing on your shoulders in a great way. I know, Terry, you're a past chair of the Iowa Olmstead Consumer Task Force, and Keith, you were one of the original members of the task force. You guys, and now more recently myself, have been working to kind of carry this forward. Maybe you can talk about what happened in the early days.
Jerry, take it from there.
And the law that Jeff was alluding to was in fact the Americans with Disability Act is where that was determined. After the Olmstead decision came out in 1999, Governor Vilsack appointed the Department of Human Services to be the entity that would oversee the implementation of that act. As a result, there were 20-some public hearings scheduled around the state of Iowa that concluded in early 2000, which was when I got connected through my work with the Statewide Independent Living Council. And at that point, there were representatives from each of those public hearings that came together and basically started the framework of what became the Iowa Plan for Community Living, which was Iowa's Olmstead Plan. Then through that group morphed into the group that was the original Olmstead Consumer Task Force, and one of the first things that task force got involved in was shortly after the second President Bush came to office. He had what was called the New Freedom Initiative, which earmarked billions of dollars for real choice systems change grants for the states to begin implementing the Olmstead decision and to begin looking at how they provided services to folks with disabilities. And we worked on developing that plan. We worked on applying for the grant and received the grant in the fall of, or slightly before the fall of 2001, which unfortunately coincided with the state of Iowa having some fairly severe financial problems and resulted in the layoffs of hundreds of state employees, which meant we had $1 million+ grant and nobody to run the grant. So it took about a year working with groups like the Governor's DD Council and the Center for Disabilities and Development to work out a contract method with what was CDD. During that time, in 2002, the idea began to surface that what President Bush had done with the New Freedoms Initiative was to appoint members of the different departments of transportation and DHS and all this to come together and see what they could do to assist in implementation of the Olmstead decision. Well, the idea was floated that, gee, wouldn't that be a cool thing to copy? And in November of 2002, Governor Vilsack decided he was going to do that and then signed it just after the beginning of 2003. And there were 20 state agencies that were designated to participate in this, and each had a staff person that was assigned to be a representative to the task force. And also, Governor Vilsack designated then Lieutenant Governor Peterson as the person who would oversee that. And that yearly, the agencies would submit their Olmstead plan. Each agency was required to come up with their own agency Olmstead plan.
So Terry, let me just jump in and ask a question. You and I both know that state agency folks and bureaucratic types can spend a tremendous amount of time in meetings and planning
Yeah.
and making plans and,
Yes.
and doing plans. Early on, what would you say the real tangible changes that affect Iowans with disabilities? I mean, over the first, say, 5 or 6 years of the Olmstead Task Force, what do you really consider the big wins?
Well, a lot of it was the different agencies recognizing that they actually served people with disabilities.
Good.
You know, it was because you had groups, DOT, you know, we deal with roads and bridges, and so what do you mean? Well, you also deal with the paratransit systems in
Right.
the state,
Right.
with accessible roads and that.
Right.
Right. You know, Department of Management, you know, well,
Right.
you know, what do we, you have people use your website? Well, yeah. Is your website accessible?
Right.
Uh-oh. And all these different agencies who, you know, after they realized they served them, the second thing was, do you serve them in person? Can people come to you to get services, or do they have to do it another way? And,
Right.
you know, again, you have people, oh, well, you know, really just as soon not talk about that. Is there something else? Are your materials, your brochures, your
Yeah.
things, are they available in alternate formats?
So there was a huge change in awareness,
Mm-hmm.
attitude, and really, it really moved the concept of the ADA into, oh, this is how, I'm a public servant, how do I serve those parts of the public that might
Exactly.
need accommodation?
And I don't think the general public out there realizes that in order to put a law into place, a lot of things have to be in place first.
Yep.
You just can't put a law into effect without having the backup mechanism.
Well, that systems change component, I mean, it takes a bloody long time
Yes, it does.
to happen. And you and I were talking earlier, I know, about, you know, it seems like things go a little bit slower than we want it
Yeah.
to. We're not getting any younger. But it does, I think it has moved forward. And I know that I've been on the task force now for a few years, and I came into it as an advocate for people with brain injuries, you know, kind of a one component of Iowans with disabilities, realizing that there were some clear American with Disabilities Act violations happening for Iowans with brain injuries, and that the Olmstead Task Force had a history of making a difference there. And I think that really we've learned in at least the disability community that deals with brain injury, that what you folks had done to educate state agencies was very effective when we kind of used that word, oh, this is an Olmstead violation. There was suddenly an interest and willingness to change certain systems. One example, there were Iowans with brain injury who had been on Medicaid waiting lists for up to 18 months, and there were long waiting lists, 900 people. That is, can be interpreted as a violation of that Supreme Court decision, because it's not a reasonable amount of time to have people wait for community-based services. This was for waiver services. When that was articulated, the legislature and the state agencies released over a couple of years an additional $10 million. So this translates not just into and only into changed brochures, but this translates into at least tens of millions of dollars, which turns into services and supports that keep people from having to go into nursing homes, and helps people come in from out-of-state placements for services, helps people live in the community. So really, it's a big deal.
And no matter how much we show the public that it costs less to keep people in their own environment. We still have to remind the legislators that it needs to be accomplished.
It's not only the right thing to do, it's not only the less expensive thing to do,
Right.
it's the law.
Yes.
And that last piece is often ignored until you can make the case that it's cheaper and better.
Yeah.
Well, Iowans like to do the right thing.
And the other thing that makes the Iowa Olmstead Consumer Task Force so unique is it basically created all its own rules. You know, part of we didn't have any bylaws. We didn't have anything that said these are how many members you'll have. These are who they will represent in that. And we decided on, how many people would be people with disabilities? How many people would represent, the elderly? How many people would represent family members? How many people would be state agency people? How many people would be from advocacy organizations?
True.
And we're responsible then for recruiting those people and firing people up to do it. And in those early days, oh my God, there were many varying ways about how we should get from point A to point B.
Yes.
But there was never a doubt that we wanted to go to point B. And so we yelled and we screamed and we pounded tables. And we left every meeting more fired up than we had been before. And everybody understood nothing was personal.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to get to the promised land. Some wanted to go by boat, some wanted to go by plane, and some wanted to walk. So, getting everybody on the same path was slow, but everybody knew where they wanted to go.
When I showed up at the task force a couple of years ago, there was a sense that the efforts were coming into real, full, mature fruition, and I'm really grateful that that's happened. So since I've been around, I've seen the task force have a tremendous impact. For example, just this last year, there was a piece of legislation that was going to remove $1 million from a disability housing program at the Iowa Finance Authority. And the task force wrote a letter to the governor describing how this could be and was a violation of the law. The governor vetoed it. So there's now another extra $1 million in for the revolving loan fund for low-income housing. The task force has taken on the issues of housing, employment, and the direct care workforce in terms of training and support. They've been involved with this overall mental health and disability service system redesign. And there have been task force members who've been showing up to try to make the redesign, which is in and of itself a 900-pound gorilla, to make it less worse and maybe even a little bit better. And there's been a big focus more recently on Medicaid. The recent Supreme Court ruling that upheld the Affordable Health Care Act allows states to consider whether they want to expand Medicaid, and it's still up in the air about whether Iowa's going to move forward with that. But it appears that the Olmstead Task Force, from how I've talked to people, are very supportive of folks having access to health care. The piece that I also want to point out is the Olmstead Task Force is open to anybody who might want to show up and apply. It's a competitive group. I mean, this last year we turned away, sadly, we had, I think, 20, 30 more applications for positions than were available. But it's a place that has visibility and clout in changing the system of services and state agencies to actually impact the expressed needs of people with disabilities and caregivers and advocates.
There is a very subtle change I noticed with new agency members coming up, they're a little more flexible when it comes to our requests.
Mm-hmm.
Way back in the 90s, you still have the same old, same old.
Yep.
You needed to do this to get to that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a waste of people's time.
Totally.
Sure. Well, I mean, some of the things that, as far as system change, the task force has been greatly involved in the past. The task force played a large part in getting CDAC started, which was consumer-directed attendant care,
Right.
which allows people to hire and fire their own workers and supervise them. That was something that started in the early 2000s with the discussion and was talked about over and over. The task force helped to start one of the first housing summits that brought together contractors and builders and apartment managers and the whole lending agencies and the whole group involved in housing. And that had a couple summits. One of the other things that began Governor Vilsack's second term was a promise to add or save an additional 1,000 accessible housing units, I believe it was, and they delivered on that.
That's huge.
So in the last couple years, the task force has worked very closely with the Department of Human Services in the whole mental health disability services redesign bill, and made many suggestions for items that should be included that were accepted.
Yep.
And the real good feeling that comes from having been around the task force from the beginning is the task force has now gained the respect of a lot of other organizations and the realization that there's a whole lot of experience and knowledge on the task force that other groups are acknowledging it's good to tap into for.
Agreed.
And are ready to take on some more meaty issues.
The accountability factor, I think, is really helpful. When you have a group like the task force who shows up in front of state agency leaderships on a regular basis and asks, show us what you've done in a period over the last period of time on behalf of moving Iowa forward to become more supportive of people with disabilities, and in terms of generating the supports to have a life in the community. And I think that's one of the things the task force has really increased its visibility and capacity and its clout in saying we need all tax-paying organizations, taxpayer spending organizations, Department of Human Services, Department of Transportation, Department of Management, to show what are you doing on behalf, not just meeting, not just planning to plan, but making significant changes. A piece that occurs to me is the fact that we've discovered over the last few years that Iowa has more than 50% of the funding that goes for supporting people with disabilities goes to institutional care. We're imbalanced. We have more than half the money that goes to supporting institutions. We know, talking to people, that they don't want to be in institutions, typically. And so Iowa has made a commitment, based on the task force, to reduce that to below 50% as a start. That's a start.
That's a start.
Yep.
Well, and another program that the task force was involved in helping to happen was the Money Follows the Person program in Iowa, which gets individuals out of institutions and assists with paying the startup costs to get into an apartment, to have the assistance that they need from staff to find places, and that that has gone on, and we've been lucky enough on our show recently to have
Yeah.
some of the folks who have transitioned out of the institutions and are in home and community-based programs.
That's awesome.
And, we're thrilled with the idea of it.
Yep.
We've also been able to have folks from a REM program called the Home Host Program, which is similar to the Money Follows the Person, except that's geared individually at folks who have been out and maybe not succeeded in a large group home setting, but going into a home with a family. The hope is that will be a placement, and we had a couple of those folks on last week, which has been wonderful.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of stuff over the last 12 years, and it's amazing to look back and think 12 years
Right.
that this has been going on.
So if somebody wanted to be either more knowledgeable about or get involved, you've been the web guru. Where do they go?
I believe they're flashing the address for the
Awesome.
Olmstead Task Force on.
Okay. Can search Google for Iowa Olmstead.
That will get you there. I
That'll
believe.
find you.
One thing, Terry, and I always remind people, it's up to the next generation of people with disabilities to pick up where we have left off.
Well,
Because
certainly,
if they don't, it's going to be a very slow and tedious process.
and certainly, we've come a long way, as we've mentioned before. The 22nd anniversary of the ADA
Right.
is today. We'll be having our celebration here in Johnson County on Saturday from 10 to 4 at the Coral Ridge Mall, and encourage everybody to come out for that. But the key is, a law is only as good as the people it was designed
Yeah.
for demand that it be.
Good way to end.
agree.
Good way to
The
end.
ADA has come a long ways too, but we still have a ways to go. And we've run out of time again. Thanks, Jeff, for joining
It's a
us
pleasure.
today.
Thank you.
As always, thanks, Keith.
Thank you.
Thank everybody at home.
Thank you all. Good evening. Stay cool.